Two 8-year-old twins vanished without a trace from a quiet Massachusetts harbor town in 1985. For 15 years, their mother lived in torment, not knowing if her daughters were alive or dead. Then one morning, a fisherman's net dragged something impossible from the ocean's depths at a place locals feared to go, Devil's Drop. What emerged from those dark waters would expose a truth so horrifying, it would destroy everything she thought she knew about that summer day. This is the story of how one mother's worst nightmare became something far more sinister than she ever imagined. August 12, 1985. Rockport, Massachusetts, a picturesque fishing town nestled in Essex County where weathered fishing boats bobbed in the harbor, and the scent of salt air mixed with fresh catch filled the streets. This was a place where everyone knew everyone, where children played safely until the streetlights came on, where the biggest worry was whether the day's catch would be good. 8-year-old twins Leia and Daisy Mercer were inseparable, mirror images of each other with bright eyes and infectious laughter. That summer morning started like any other. The girls grabbed their beloved red radio flyer wagon, the same one they'd received for Christmas 2 years earlier, already bearing the scars of countless adventures. Their destination was the small park just across the road and around the corner from their house. It was their favorite spot, close enough that their mother Maureen could almost see them from her kitchen window. Maureen, who ran Mercer's Fresh Catch, the town's most successful fish market stall, trusted this routine completely. In Rockport, children were safe. In Rockport, nothing bad ever happened. She expected them home by 5:30 for dinner, just like always. 30 came and went. Then 6, then 6:30. By 7, Maureen was running through the streets calling their names. The park was empty, the wagon nowhere to be found. She checked every store, every friend's house, every place the girls had ever been. Police launched an immediate and massive search operation. Every boat in the harbor was boarded and searched. Every house in town was checked, basements to attics. Every resident was questioned, some multiple times. Search dogs traced the girls sent to the park, then nothing. The trail simply ended, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to months. The FBI was called in. Psychics were consulted. Reward money was offered. Nothing. Maureen's life completely shattered. She closed her thriving business that had been her pride and joy, unable to bear the pitying looks of customers or the well-meaning questions about the investigation. She became a ghost in her own town, haunted by unanswered questions that gnawed at her soul. Where were her babies? Were they alive somewhere, calling for their mother? Were they suffering? Were they still breathing? The not knowing was a special kind of torture, worse than any confirmed death could have been. 15 years passed. 15 years of sleepless nights, of jumping every time the phone rang, of seeing her daughter's faces in every crowd, of endless, devastating wondering. Morning, year 2000. The harbor still looked the same, but everything had changed. Fewer boats worked the waters now, and the old-timers who remembered the Mercer twins were beginning to retire or pass away. Fisherman Tommy Caldwell was facing his own crisis. At 50-something, with weathered hands and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he'd been working these waters for 30 years. But lately the fish were scarce in his usual spots. Climate change, pollution, overfishing, whatever the cause, Tommy was desperate. There was one place he'd never tried. One area every fisherman in Rockport avoided: Devil's Drop. The name alone was enough to keep most boats away. Devil's Drop was legendary among local fishermen, a section of ocean where treacherous currents swirled around jagged underwater rocks, creating a maritime graveyard that had claimed boats for generations. In 1978, the trawler Mary Catherine had been torn apart there, and 3 men barely survived the ordeal. Most fishermen called it cursed. They whispered that the sea kept some places for herself, and Devil's Drop was one of them. But Tommy was desperate. His family needed the income, and the fish weren't biting anywhere else. That morning he steered his boat toward the forbidden waters, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. As he cast his nets into those dark depths, he muttered a prayer and hoped he wasn't making the biggest mistake of his life. When he began hauling in his nets, something felt wrong. They were impossibly heavy, tangled with debris that had been accumulating for years in those treacherous waters. Broken fishing equipment, rotted rope, chunks of metal, 15 years' worth of maritime garbage. And then he saw it. Barnacle-crusted, missing one wheel streaked with rust and algae, but unmistakably, impossibly a red radio flyer wagon. Tommy's blood turned to ice. He'd lived in Rockport his entire life. He remembered those missing person flyers from 1985, the ones that had been posted on every telephone pole, in every store window. The same wagon, the same distinctive scratches, the same faded red paint beneath the ocean's decay. His hands shaking, Tommy immediately called the police on his radio. Within minutes, every available unit was racing toward the harbor. Detective Morrison arrived first, the same man who'd handled the original case 15 years earlier. His hair was grayer now, his face more lined, but his eyes still held the same determination that had driven him to never officially close the case. Within hours, he was standing on Morin Mercer's doorstep with news that would change everything. At the harbor, a crowd had gathered. Word traveled fast in a small town, and soon half of Rockport seemed to be watching as police photographers documented the wagon from every angle. Morin's hands trembled as she approached the blue tarp where her daughter's wagon lay, a relic from a happier time when her biggest worry was getting the girls home for dinner. Every detail was heartbreakingly familiar. The scratch along one side where Daisy had dragged it against the garage door, the faint traces of purple nail polish where Leia had attempted to redecorate it just days before they disappeared. But this discovery raised a terrifying new question. If the wagon was, at Devil's Drop, 15 miles from shore in waters too dangerous for children to reach, someone with a boat had put it there. Someone who knew these waters. Someone from their own community. The realization hit the crowd like a physical blow. For 15 years, they'd assumed the girls had been taken by a stranger, someone passing through town. But now they knew the truth was far more sinister. The monster they'd been looking for wasn't a stranger at all. He was one of them. For the first time in 15 years, Morin forced herself to return to the harbor district. Every step was agony. Memories of her daughters calling out from every familiar corner, every weathered building, every fish-scented breeze. Her first stop was the fish market where she'd once run the most successful stall in town. The layout hadn't changed much, but the faces were different. Younger, unfamiliar. And there in her old prime corner spot was Frank Ditz. Frank had always been a difficult man, even back when they'd been competitors. She remembered him as prideful and bitter, struggling to make ends meet while her business thrived. But now, occupying her old spot, he seemed to have found success at last. When she approached his stall, Frank looked up with cold, calculating eyes. He was harder than she remembered, rougher around the edges, with a permanent scowl that seemed carved into his weathered face. "Well, well," Frank said, his voice gravelly from decades of salt air and cigarettes. "After 15 years, you finally show your face here again." The words stung, but Morin pressed on. When she mentioned the wagon's discovery, something flickered in Frank's eyes, something that made her deeply uneasy. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual gruff demeanor, but she'd seen it, recognition, and something else. Fear. Later that day, as Morin prepared to leave the harbor, she witnessed something that would haunt her dreams. From the shadow of the auction house, she watched Frank in heated conversation with Jessie Vaughn, a worker from the local cutting house. Frank was agitated, demanding something. Jessie was refusing, shaking his head frantically. Their voices were too low to hear clearly, but their body language told the story. Frank was threatening, Jessie was terrified. Money changed hands, then keys. Jessie handed over what looked like a full key ring, his face pale with fear. Frank pocketed the keys and walked away without another word, leaving Jessie standing alone by his truck, visibly shaking. That evening, as Moran drove home through the familiar streets of Rockport, her mind raced with questions. The exchange she'd witnessed felt wrong, dangerous, but she had no proof, no real evidence, just the nagging feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She was 3 blocks from home when a car swerved dangerously in front of her, nearly causing an accident. The driver's door flew open and Jesse Vaughn stumbled out, his face flushed with panic. "I need to talk to you," he shouted, waving his arms frantically. Right now. What Jesse told her next would shatter her world completely. For weeks, Frank had been pressuring Jesse to rent his boat and boathouse. At first, Jesse had refused. He needed the space for his own work. But Frank had become increasingly aggressive, offering more and more money, becoming threatening when Jesse continued to refuse. That morning, Frank had shown Jesse something that made his blood run cold. A photograph of 2 adult women who looked remarkably similar to the missing Mercer twins. The resemblance was unmistakable, even accounting for 15 years of aging. Frank had claimed he needed to tie up loose ends. He'd threatened Jesse's life and the life of his boss, Mark, if Jesse didn't cooperate. He'd promised that if Jesse stayed silent and let him use the boat, the police would never find what he'd done. Jesse had seen the old missing person flyers. He'd grown up in Rockport, remembered the massive search effort. The women in Frank's photograph were definitely the Mercer twins, older but unmistakable. Moran's world tilted on its axis. Her daughters, alive? After 15 years of believing, they were dead. Was it possible they were still breathing, still in this world? But if that was true, if Frank really did have them, then every day of delay could mean the difference between life and death. The terrible truth was finally emerging. Frank Ditz, the bitter fisherman who'd blamed Moran for his business failures, had been hiding the ultimate secret for 15 years. He'd taken her daughters not just to hurt her, but to systematically destroy her life while building his own success on the ruins of her family. The monster had been hiding in plain sight, right there in the fish market, occupying the very spot where Moran had once stood every day, serving the community that had rallied around her during those dark early days of the search. How many times had Frank looked customers in the eye, accepting their sympathy, their theories about what might have happened to the Mercer girls, all while knowing exactly where they were? Moran called Detective Morrison immediately. Police moved swiftly but carefully. If Frank truly had one of the twins, any misstep could be fatal. Jesse led them to his boathouse, but it was empty. Then Jesse remembered. Frank had also demanded keys to his fishery house at the old Brennan site. Racing against time, police surrounded the abandoned fishery. Through the windows, they could see Frank inside with an unconscious young woman. The raid was swift and brutal. Frank was arrested as he prepared to murder his victim, a 23-year-old woman who was indeed Leah Mercer, kept captive for 15 years. But the reunion was bittersweet. Through tears, Leah revealed the horrifying truth. Frank had convinced the twins that their mother was dead, had moved them between different locations for years, lending them to other predators in exchange for silence. When Daisy tried to escape, at age 14, Frank murdered her in the most brutal way imaginable. In the interrogation room, Frank Ditz finally revealed the full scope of his twisted revenge. The story that emerged was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. On August 12, 1985, Frank had approached the twins in the park with promises of ice cream and a fishing trip. He'd told them he had their mother's permission, that they were going to catch fish for dinner and make her proud. Instead, he'd driven them to his house, sedated them, and hidden them in the locked cabin of his trawler. For months, while police searched frantically, Frank had been moving the girls between different harbors along the coast, part of a network of fishermen who traded silence for unspeakable access. When the initial investigation cooled, Frank had moved them to his basement. He'd convinced the girls that their parents had died in a plane crash, that their bodies were never recovered. He'd told them they were orphans now, dependent on his kindness for survival. For years, he'd given them small amounts of money, telling them that if they were good and quiet, they could save enough to leave someday. It was a lie designed to give them false hope while ensuring their compliance. The twins had lived in his basement for over a decade, their childhood stolen, their innocence destroyed. When Daisy tried to escape at age 14, Frank's response was swift and brutal. He murdered her in a fit of rage, then disposed of her body using the acid processing equipment from his fish business. Laya had been alone with him ever since, a prisoner in her own hometown, kept alive only because Frank enjoyed the power he held over both her and her mother. The red wagon had been thrown into Devil's Drop years earlier, Frank's twisted calling card, hidden in waters too dangerous for most fishermen to search. It was his way of disposing of evidence while simultaneously taunting the community with a clue that would likely never be found. Frank's motive was as simple as it was evil: jealousy and revenge. He blamed Moren's successful fish market for his own business failures. In his twisted mind, destroying her family was justified payback for taking his customers, his success, his place in the community. The most chilling revelation was how Frank had used the tragedy to his advantage. After the twins disappeared, and Moren closed her stall in grief, Frank had swooped in to claim her prime corner spot. He'd built his success literally on the ruins of the family he'd destroyed, serving customers who came to him partly out of sympathy for the community's loss. For 15 years, Frank had looked Moren's friends and neighbors in the eye, accepting their theories about what might have happened to the girls, all while holding the ultimate secret. Frank Ditz was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Jesse Vaughn, despite his initial complicity born of fear, received a reduced sentence of 2 years for his crucial role in saving Laya's life. The case became a grim reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes the monsters we should fear most are the ones who smile and nod at community meetings, who serve us at local businesses, who've lived among us for years while hiding darkness that defies comprehension. After 15 years of torment, Moren and Laya were finally reunited, but their healing would take time to rebuild a relationship between a mother and daughter who'd been apart for more than half of Laya's life, time to grieve for Daisy, time to find a way forward from unimaginable trauma. The ocean had finally given up its secrets at Devil's Drop, pulled from those cursed waters by a fisherman brave enough to cast his nets where others feared to go. But some truths, once revealed, prove more horrifying than the mysteries they replace. And some wounds, no matter how much time passes, never fully heal. The red wagon sits in an evidence locker to this day, a rusted reminder that evil can lurk in the most familiar places, wearing the most trusted faces, hiding behind the most ordinary smiles.